October, November 1914. The first week at sea was an absolute misery for both the men and their horses. The Tasman was at its stormiest, with heavy swells surging over the ships and white spray sweeping across the decks. Many of the men suffered dreadfully from seasickness as the ships rolled and pitched. On Billy and Jack's deck alone, rows of men lay huddled in their bunks, their faces deathly pale. The sickly stench of vomit spewed from tin buckets lining the holds. Billy felt his own insides flip with each rise of the ship, but he managed to stay on his feet. One of the worst hit by seasickness was Chopper. He moaned like a butchered beast from his bunk. Jack couldn't help but tease him. "What was it you said to our Billy about being green about the gills? Your whole face looks as white as a fish's belly." "Come on, Jack, leave him be. We've got horses to feed," Billy said, tugging at Jack's shirt sleeve. 3 times a day, the troopers had to water and feed their horses a mixed ration of chaff, oats, hay, and linseed oil. But the poor horses were struggling to eat. They were sicker than the men. They hung their heads over their stalls, struggling to stay upright on the reeling, reeking horse decks. Of all the ships, the Orari carried the most horses. 728 of them stalled on 5 decks, some of the decks below the waterline. Their narrow, cramped stalls were spread with coconut matting to help them stand. But still they stumbled and fell in the lurching seas. Nearly every minute of Billy and Jack's waking hours were taken up with caring for the horses. Each mounted rifleman was responsible for about 5 horses during their shift. But with so many of the men out of action due to seasickness, Billy and Jack had little rest. Billy felt desperately sorry for Tui. She was bearing up bravely, bracing herself against the sides of her stall each time the ship heaved and hawed. But already her long, fine legs were scratched and bleeding from constant stumbles, and Billy could see the confusion and fear in her trusting eyes. "Do you get a bit scared sometimes?" he asked Jack one morning as they mucked out the stalls, collecting the horse manure in baskets. It was hard work slipping and sliding across the surging deck, and it didn't seem to matter how often they mucked out. It still stank like hell in the closed hold. "Tui's scared, yet I've never known a braver horse." "Yeah, but she's just a horse. They don't understand," Jack replied, digging his spade into another pile of steaming droppings. "Imagine if you were a horse grazing in some nice green field, then suddenly you were thrown into this grotty hole with the ground bucking under your feet. It sure must be scary for them. I don't mean just this, but if we really get to the war and see some action, aren't you a bit scared about that?" Billy had been thinking about this a fair bit lately. It'll be no worse than pig hunting out in the bush, with those huge tuskers coming at you and all the squealing and the blood. It'll be all right. Anyway, most of the boys reckon we'll never even get to fire a single shot. Billy took comfort in the older boy's words. After all, he was probably right. It could be scary out pig hunting, and with more blood than you could throw an axe at. War couldn't be much worse. One of the worst behaved horses below deck was Chopper's horse, Trojan. Billy and Jack could hear him kicking the sides of his stall as they worked, splintering the wood in his rage. His squeals upset the rest of the horses on their deck, frightening an already tense lot.
"Don't allow the bad-tempered horses on board."
"The last thing we need are biters and kickers." "But do those stuck-up officer chaps ever listen?" Major Joe complained to them. Major Joe was the on-board military veterinary surgeon. Every ship had one, and Billy and Jack reckoned they had the best. He was a fair dinkum major, but rather than demanding they address him properly, he told them simply to call him Joe. He knew a lot about horses and really cared for them. He was devastated when early on in the rough voyage a horse had fallen and broken its leg. He'd had no choice but to shoot it. Billy had seen the sadness etched on the vet's face as a crane hoisted the body overboard and dropped it into the swirling ocean. Billy had been watching Chopper's horse Trojan for some time now. He recalled how the horse's eyes had rolled the first time Chopper leapt on his back wearing spurs. He'd kicked out then too. Then Billy remembered how quietly and gently Trojan had stood for Chopper's little girl. Billy had an idea and thought he'd ask Major Joe for his opinion. "You know how Trojan kicks out in his stall?" he began as he helped the vet bandage a horse's injured fetlock. They could hear Trojan smashing at his stall as they worked. "Yep, he's a bad-tempered sod if ever I've known one," the vet said. "Could he just be scared like Tui? She shows her fear by facing it, but he's a fighter and battles it." "Well, you could have a point. This is no natural place for a horse, and they all react differently to stress like people. So, has he spent time with your mare before?" Back at training camp, he was stalled alongside Tui and Kate. He was quiet with them. "Rightio, let's go with your hunch and see what happens if we move him." Often horses take courage from other horses they trust. He can have the bay gelding stall next to Tui and Kate. The vet led the bay gelding out of the stall while Billy fetched Trojan. He undid the rope securing his halter and led him along the narrow aisle running between the stalls. Trojan slipped and stumbled as the ship rolled and lurched. The vet cursed. "As soon as this blasted sea calms down, we need to get these horses out and about to stretch their poor legs. He's so stiff he can barely walk." They managed to swap the horses over and settle Trojan into his new stall alongside Tui and Kate. At first he fretted and fidgeted, about to kick out at his new prison, but Tui leant across the bars separating their stalls and gently nibbled his neck as if to say, "We're all in this together. Settle down." After a few minutes he stopped fidgeting and actually ate some hay from his manger. "Well, I'll be damned. You were right, Billy. Well done," the vet said. By dawn on the 5th day of their voyage, the sea began to calm. Both the men and their horses found their sea legs and started to adjust to life on board. Even Chopper tossed aside his army blankets and was ready for duty. "Where's my ruddy horse?" he hollered the first time he went down below deck for feeding time. "You better not tell me he was one of them went overboard." "He's along here," the vet yelled back. "And you can thank young Billy he's still in one piece. Any more kicking and he'd have done himself an injury." "Tough," Chopper said. "Reckon I could find myself a better nag in the remounts anyway. You'd better get used to looking after the one you've got. He'll be your eyes, ears and legs in this war," the vet warned. Chopper muttered under his breath, but he knew better now than to answer an officer back. On the 21st of October, the NZEEF convoy arrived at their first port of call in Hobart, Tasmania. Fresh water and provisions were brought on board and the men ordered to disembark for a 3-hour route march through town. Billy and the troops were excited to finally escape their cramped quarters and stretch their legs. The mounted riflemen led the column of more than 8,000 men on their march through the streets. The people of Hobart flocked to greet them, walking alongside and showering them with gifts of fruit, flowers, cakes and cigarettes. "Best of luck, NZers," one elderly man called, patting Billy on the back as he passed by. Billy felt incredibly proud to be parading with his fellow soldiers. As they marched, Billy noticed Chopper and a few other mounted riflemen slip from the lines, disappearing down a side street. He looked across at Jack marching beside him. "They're off for a bit of R&R, rest and recreation," Jack said, winking. When they got back to the ship, there was still no sign of Chopper. He wasn't missed until it came time to feed the horses. "Where's Trooper Williams?" "Not shirking duties again, I hope?" Major Joe asked as Billy fed and watered Trojan. Billy pretended not to hear, busying himself with grooming. The Major shook his head. "That horse is his responsibility. If he doesn't learn that, he's in for a tough war." Billy heard Chopper stumble into his bunk late that evening after lights out. He reeked of beer and cigarette smoke and was soon snoring loud enough to wake the ship rats. A cheering crowd of Hobart well-wishers saw the convoy off the next day. After some weeks at sea, the men got used to their busy schedule. Revel was at 6 a.m, followed by drill and a hurried breakfast of porridge or reheated stew from the night before. Most of the mounted riflemen's day was taken up with caring for their horses. As well as feeding and mucking out their stalls, they had to groom and exercise them. On calm days, they led groups of horses up on deck to stretch their legs in the fresh air. They laid coconut matting on the deck and walked them up and down for exercise. Billy enjoyed the hours out on deck with the horses. The first time he took Tui up, the mare snorted and skipped across the wooden deck, her hooves clattering on the hard boards. She held her head high, nostrils flared, sniffing the breeze. He was certain she liked the feel of the wind rippling through her mane and the scent of the fresh sea air. Major Joe was a stickler for insisting that the troopers groom the horses at least twice a day. "It's not so they look pretty, it's all about circulation. Horses aren't built to stand for hours in a narrow stall, so you have to help their blood flow by rubbing and brushing. Otherwise their legs will seize up." A few of the men grumbled, Chopper the loudest, but most knuckled down to looking after their horses. Although Billy had ridden horses for much of his life, he'd never spent so much time with them. He was getting to know all of their little habits. For example, Tui was the lead horse. If she stomped her foot, all the other horses around her would move forward in their stalls to see what the fuss was about. Jack's Kate was laid back and unruffled. Nothing fazed her, not even the ship's siren, which sent most of the horses scuttling to the back of their stalls. And of course Chopper's Trojan was the stroppy one. By now all the horses recognized the bugle call which announced their feeds. Happy neighs rang out across the decks as soon as the bugle sounded. Trojan alone hated the noise and would pin back his ears. Billy learnt to wait for the bugle call to end before feeding him, otherwise he'd dash across the stall and try to nip him. Chopper, however, wasn't quite so patient. The first time he tried to feed Trojan while the bugle sounded, the horse nearly took a chunk out of his arm. "You nasty nag," he hollered. "I'll show you who's boss." He raised his arm as if he was about to strike him. The horse squealed, reeling away to the far side of the stall. "That just makes him worse," Billy said, walking over to try and calm things down. "You going to tell me how to treat my own horse now? You're not even old enough to wipe your own bum. Bug off, Billy boy." "You should listen to the kid, Chopper," Major Joe interrupted, watching from a stall nearby. "He talks horse sense. There's no place for your wrestling moves here," he added, referring to the ship's on-board entertainment. During the long evenings, the various squadrons had organized wrestling matches, pitting their best fighters up against one another. Chopper was the reigning champion. Billy took the feed bucket off him. "If you wait until the bugle call is over, you can feed him without any problems." He leant over and tipped the feed into Trojan's manger. The horse walked up quietly and began eating. "Aren't you the little horse hero?" Chopper said, jabbing him in the ribs with a stubby finger. "Let's hope you can keep your little head during target shooting too." Like the wrestling matches, the troops were also running target shooting competitions. They towed a special raft behind the Arari to use as their target. On still days, they lined up on the stern and took pot shots at it. Most of the marksmen could hit the raft, but it wasn't so easy to hit the bullseye in the middle. Billy was leading the hits and was set to win hands down. "You look after your horse and I'll look after my shooting," Billy said, giving Trojan one last pat before turning his back on Chopper and walking away. On a clear blue dawn, the New Zealand convoy sailed into King George Sound, Western Australia, to join up with the Australian Imperial Force. No fewer than 26 Australian ships were there to greet them. On board were 20,000 men and 7,800 horses. As part of the Dominion, the Australians were joining up to fight side by side with their colonial cousins. To Billy, it was an amazing sight. The huge fleet lay at anchor on the still waters of the Sound. Ship horn greeted ship horn, loud cheers of welcome ringing out between the New Zealanders and the Australians. Some of the Kiwi troops performed a haka on deck while the Aussies called cooey back. The united convoy of 36 troopships and 4 warships sailed single file out into the Indian Ocean on a bright sunny morning. Billy and Jack clambered high into the rigging to watch. The great fleet stretched almost from horizon to horizon, smoke billowing from the ship's funnels. Billy felt excitement and pride puff up in him like the smoke from those funnels. "Where do you reckon we're all heading?" Chopper asked Major Joe a week or so later while they were mucking out the stalls. "I reckon it's garrison duty for us in India." Since leaving Australia, there'd been lots of rumours on board about their final destination. Originally, they'd all believed they were heading first to England, then on to fight in Europe. But news had filtered below deck that Turkey had just declared war on the British Empire. The men were placing bets about where they'd end up now. India was paying good odds, though everyone hoped and prayed they were still bound for England. "I thought I'd be having Christmas dinner with folks in London," Jack said disappointedly, chucking a spadeful of horse dung into his basket. Many of the men had family back home in the mother country, and they'd been looking forward to meeting them and seeing the sights. Billy didn't feel quite so disappointed. His family came from Ireland. Major Joe was non-committal, saying only, "Wherever we end up, it's where we're needed." "You mean like these stupid ruddy blackouts are needed?" Chopper swore. "I don't reckon the front end of this military operation knows what its back end is doing. I've not seen hide nor hair of an enemy ship or plane since we sailed." Despite themselves, Billy and Jack had to agree with Chopper. Since leaving Australian waters, the men had been ordered to seal all the portholes at night to prevent the enemy from spotting any light. But it also meant air couldn't get in. It was stinking hot in the sleeping quarters and getting worse as they neared the tropics. Chopper had a point. Why did they need to have all these silly precautions when there wasn't an enemy about? They'd begun to think they'd never even see the enemy. On the 9th of November, all that abruptly changed.